The familiar clangor of Dry Dock Gamma 7 was a symphony to me. The percussive blast of rivet guns, the shriek of grinders against high-tensile alloy, the deep, resonant groan of a half-finished cruiser settling into its moorings. These were the sounds of honest work, my work. For 37 years, I'd been shaping order from chaos with these hands, bending metal to my will. My name is Silas, and my world was made of tangible things, tolerances measured in microns, the satisfying heft of a magnetic clamp, the blue-white hiss of a perfect plasma weld. This job was a rush like all the others. A Xylosian freighter, the Star Wanderer, had limped into port with a fried power conduit, and corporate wanted it spaceworthy by 0800 tomorrow. That meant shortcuts. It meant me, the veteran foreman everyone trusted, crawling into the ship's guts alone. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and overheated coolant. Junction C9 looks stable, Control. I grunted into my comms, my voice echoing slightly inside my helmet. Flux damage seems localized to the primary regulator. Copy that, Silas. Medbay protocols still say full visor shielding for alien tech. The voice of a kid named Ren, barely old enough to hold a wrench, crackled in my ear. Kid, this regulator is a standard plasma inverter with a fancy shell on it. If I can't see the hairline fractures, I can't patch them. I shot back, already unsnapping the clasps on my heavy blast visor. The rule was for rookies who didn't know the difference between a conduit and a casket. I knew. I pushed the visor up onto my helmet, the unfiltered air hitting my face. Pride. That was my sin. The belief that my experience made me immune. The conduit's core was a milky, crystalline lattice, pulsing with a soft, residual light. Xylosian tech was organic-looking, more grown than built. I leaned closer, my diagnostic scope whirring, trying to find the microfracture I knew had to be there. For a split second, my reflection stared back at me from the crystal's polished surface. A tired man, etched with the fine lines of a life spent in harsh light. And then it happened. It wasn't a flash of light, not really. Light travels, it has speed, it makes noise. This was an event. One moment I was looking at the core, the next, existence was replaced by an eruption of silent, impossible brilliance. It wasn't white or any other color I could name. It was the concept of light, weaponized. It punched through my optic nerves, bypassed my brain's meager defenses, and hammered a message directly onto my soul. There was no sound, only the roaring silence of a star being born and dying in the same instant. Pain followed, a white-hot shriek that detonated behind my eyes and shot down my spine. I was thrown backward, not by a physical blast, but by the sheer sensory overload. My head cracked against the deck plating, and the world swam in a nauseating vortex of fire. My tools scattered, clattering uselessly against the metal. I tried to scream, but my lungs wouldn't obey. I was drowning in the after effects. Darkness started to reclaim the edges of my vision, but the blast had left a ghost behind. Not the simple glowing amoeba of a welder's flash, but something infinitely more complex. An intricate, maddening lattice of impossible angles and spiraling nested geometries. It was burned not onto my retinas, but somewhere deeper. I could feel it, a schematic of pure wrongness branded onto the very meat of my mind. Then, finally, the darkness took me completely. The medbay smelled of antiseptic and condescension. A fresh-faced medtech, no older than Wren, shone a diagnostic light into my pupils, his brow furrowed in a pantomime of deep concern. "Severe retinal burn and neurological shock, Mr. Varus," he said, the words smooth and practiced. "A classic case of welder's flash, though one of the worst I've seen. Lucky you didn't cook your optic nerves right out of their sockets." I grunted, a knot of raw pain pulsing behind my forehead. The med bay lights were dimmed to a deep twilight, but it felt like staring into a supernova. "It wasn't a welder," I mumbled, my tongue thick. "It was different." "The symptoms are the same," he said, dismissively, tapping a prescription into his datapad. "High-dose painkillers, ocular repair gel, and 2 days of absolute darkness. Stay in your hab, keep the lights off, your vision should return to normal." He didn't get it. I tried to explain the afterimage, the pattern, but the words came out as a jumbled mess. I couldn't describe it. How do you describe a shape that defies Euclidean space? A geometry that seems to look back at you? He just nodded patiently and added temporary aphasia due to neural trauma to my chart. They sent me home in a haze of painkillers that barely dulled the edges of the agony. My hab unit was a small, functional box, a place to sleep and not much else. I sealed the viewport, plunging the room into an inky blackness that should have been a comfort. But the pattern was still there. It glowed in the darkness behind my eyelids, a filigree of impossible lines and terrifyingly perfect curves. It was faint at first, a neurological ghost, the static the medtech had promised. But it wasn't static. Static is random. This was intentional, ordered. By the second day, my eyesight started to return in blurry patches. The world swam back into focus, but it was corrupted. The simple, straight line of the seam between the wall plates now had a faint, shimmering overlay, a series of interconnected triangular spirals that seemed to twist into a dimension I couldn't perceive. The condensation rings from a glass of water on my nightstand became concentric, interlocking circles that pulsed with a slow, sickly rhythm. It was a superimposed reality, a blueprint laid over the world. "It's just nerve damage," I told myself, my own voice a hollow whisper in the silent room. "The signal from my eyes to my brain is scrambled. It'll fade." But it didn't fade. It grew stronger, sharper, and with the clarity came a feeling, a sickening resonance that vibrated deep in my bones. The rhythm of its pulsing started to feel familiar, like the thrum of a great machine warming up. It wasn't an injury. An injury is chaos, a breakdown of a system. This was the opposite. This was a design, a language. And as I lay there in the dark, watching the geometry dance and writhe over the mundane surfaces of my room, I felt a terrifying certainty coalesce in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't a symptom I was looking at. It was an instruction. The need started in my hands. A faint tremor at first, easily dismissed as a side effect of the painkillers. Then an itch deep in the muscles of my forearms, a kinetic craving that had nothing to do with any simple nerve damage. It was the same feeling I got just before striking a perfect weld, an instinctual understanding of how two pieces of metal needed to fit together. Only now, the instinct wasn't mine. I stumbled out of my hab unit on the third day, my head still throbbing, but the visual artifacts having sharpened into an undeniable, translucent blueprint floating over the world. The medbay had cleared me for light duty, a supervisor role. "Stay off the tools, Silas," the chief had ordered over the comm. A laughably empty command. The tools were already in my head. I found myself in my workshop, not the main fabrication floor, but my personal alcove where I kept my best gear. Without conscious thought, I grabbed a carbon stylus. My hand, guided by a will that was not entirely my own, began to move across a discarded sheet of plasteel. The shapes that emerged were alien, horrific, sweeping, serrated arcs connected by impossibly sharp angles, the same non-Euclidean nonsense that plagued my vision. I stared at the sketch, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a fragment of the pattern, made real. A wave of nausea and primal fear washed over me. I threw the stylus down. It clattered across the workbench. No, this isn't me. I had to get out, away from the raw materials, away from the familiar hum of the dry dock's machinery that now felt like a seductive whisper. The station proper, with its sterile corridors, public spaces, and crowds of people, felt like the only sanctuary. I turned on my heel and marched towards the transport hub, my boots echoing a frantic rhythm on the grated flooring. I made it 100 meters before the pressure began. It started as a dull ache at the base of my skull, a familiar throb of a migraine. With each step I took away from the industrial sector, it intensified. 200 meters, and it was a sharp, piercing pain, like a hot needle being driven into my brainstem. 300, and my vision swam, the geometric overlays flaring with blinding intensity. It felt like my skull was being compressed in a magnetic vice, the agony so absolute it dropped me to my knees. A low moan escaped my lips. I gasped for air, clutching my head. My entire nervous system screamed a single, undeniable command: go back. Fighting through the pain, I lurched to my feet and tried to take another step toward the transport hub. The pressure redoubled. Black spots danced in my vision, and a wave of vertigo threatened to send me sprawling. It was an invisible leash, a psychic tether, and the anchor was somewhere back in the shipyard. Defeated, I turned around. The moment I took a single step back towards the dry dock, the crushing pressure eased by a fraction. Another step, and it lessened again. It wasn't just a compulsion anymore. It was a physical cage, its bars defined by my proximity to metal, to tools, to the raw potential of the forge. I wasn't just a man with an injury. I was a prisoner, tethered to the very place where my torment began, chained to an architect that desperately wanted me to build. The medtechs were useless. My own experience was irrelevant. This wasn't an injury, it was an infection of the mind, and if I wanted to fight it, I needed to understand the source. That meant learning about the alien vessel, the Star Wanderer. But official channels were a dead end. Every inquiry I made was deflected with corporate double talk about proprietary technology and interspecies trade agreements. Fine. I'd built half the systems on this station. I knew their back doors, too. Late into the third shift, when the administrative decks were quiet, I slipped into a records archive. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of dust and ozone from the servers. Hunching over a public terminal, I keyed in my old foreman's override codes, privileges they hadn't gotten around to revoking yet. The station's central archive blinked to life. A few carefully worded search queries and a bypass of a level 2 security firewall later, I had it. The full technical manifest and docking report for the Zilosian freighter. The first files were garbage. Trade manifests, crew rosters, gravimetric readings, all meaningless data to me. But then I opened the primary schematics for the power system, the files labeled Conduit Assembly C9. My breath caught in my throat. The screen was filled with engineering diagrams rendered in cold, precise blue lines. The language of the annotations was indecipherable, a mess of alien script. But the shapes were horribly, intimately familiar. A spiraling energy lattice, interlocking nodes built on impossible geometries. It wasn't just similar to the pattern seared into my brain. It was the pattern. I was staring at a professional, technical rendering of my own madness. My hands started to shake. This wasn't a random psychic backlash. I had downloaded a blueprint. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. With trembling fingers, I navigated out of the technical files and began cross-referencing the ship's registry, its flight path, its history. Most of it was standard cargo hauling junk, but one entry stood out. A record from its last port of call in the sparsely populated Kepler-186 system. It wasn't a trade log. It was a heavily redacted incident report filed by an autonomous military quarantine drone. Most of the report was just blocks of solid black, censored by some high-level authority. But a few fragmented phrases remained, cold and clinical in the sterile font of the terminal. Unidentified signal source emanating from K186F. Vessel Star Wanderer attempted to render assistance. Quarantine Protocol 8 Sigma failed. Catastrophic biological and psychic contamination. Full crew manifest considered redacted. The last legible line hit me like a physical blow, turning the blood in my veins to ice. Signal source identified. Recommend planetary sterilization. Total loss of life. I leaned back in the chair, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The thing in my head, the compulsive urge to build that had taken root in my soul. It wasn't a schematic for a simple power conduit. That conduit was just one small piece of a much larger, more terrible machine. It was an antenna, a beacon, a weapon that didn't just kill people, it consumed them. And whatever contagion had wiped out that colony world and the crew of the Star Wanderer, it was now nesting behind my eyes, begging me to build it a new home. The clock. The world is ticking, and her time is running out. The fight for my own mind became a siege. I stopped sleeping, subsisting on stim patches and stale coffee, terrified of what my hands might do if my consciousness loosened its grip for even a moment. I locked my tools away, barricaded the door to my workshop. I paced my HAB unit like a caged animal, reciting ship specifications and warp field equations, anything to fill my head with my own thoughts, to drown out the constant, silent whisper of the pattern. It wasn't enough. The blueprint was no longer a passive imprint, a ghost in my machine. It had become an active, predatory intelligence. It was patient. It learned my rhythms, the moments my will was at its weakest. It was an architect in my skull, and it was stalking me. The first time it truly broke through was after 40 hours without sleep. My thoughts were a slurry of exhaustion and fear. I remember sitting on the edge of my bunk, staring at my trembling hands, telling myself I just needed to close my eyes for 5 minutes. Just 5. I woke up on the cold floor of my workshop. Confusion came first, thick and disorienting. Then a tidal wave of ice-cold dread. The door to the workshop wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open. The tools I had so carefully hidden were scattered across the main workbench, gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. And in the center of the room stood a collection of metal sculptures. They were jagged, bizarre things, assembled from scrap plating, steel rebar, and lengths of copper wiring I didn't even know I had. They were clearly unfinished, fragments of a larger design, yet they held a sickening, alien beauty. One was a cage of intersecting metallic ribs that curved in on themselves. Another was a spiked tripod, its legs welded at angles that should have been structurally impossible, yet it stood perfectly balanced. The welds were immaculate, clean, precise, flawless. They were my welds. I knew my own work. I didn't remember building any of it. Not a single moment. It was a clean slice out of my memory. A black void between closing my eyes in my bunk and waking up here, surrounded by the physical evidence of my own violation. No. The word was a choked whisper. I stumbled forward and touched one of the sculptures. The metal was still warm. I must have been working for hours. The architect had seized control. While I was lost in exhaustion, it had walked my body to the workshop, unlocked the door, picked up my tools, and continued its horrifying work. My skill, my knowledge, my very muscle memory, it had used them all as its own. I wasn't a shipwright anymore. I was a tool, a biological fabrication unit being piloted by a parasitic consciousness from the void. I stared at the alien shapes, at the proof of my own hands betraying me. Panic, raw and shrieking, clawed at my throat. I grabbed a heavy industrial hammer from the wall, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. With a scream that was half rage and half terror, I smashed it down on the nearest sculpture. The metal screamed and buckled. I brought the hammer down again and again, destroying the pieces, trying to unmake what it had made. But the violence felt hollow. I could destroy its work, but the architect was still there, nestled deep in my mind, waiting patiently for my next moment of weakness. They told her. They'd gathered the information, decode it, all to the point of no return. For days, I was a ghost, haunting my own life. I walked the gantries of the dry dock in a sleep-deprived haze, the architect a constant, predatory presence in my thoughts. Every flicker of a light, every hum of a transformer felt like it was whispering instructions, coaxing my hands to wander back to the workshop and resume their alien labor. I was losing. The periods of lost time grew more frequent, the half-finished sculptures more complex. The psychic pressure was a constant, grinding weight, wearing down my will, pulverizing my sense of self. Then, walking past Bay 4, I saw it. The degaussing chamber. A colossal 30-meter cube of reinforced ceramic and copper coils. It was designed for one purpose: to generate an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to wipe the residual magnetic signature from a frigate's hull. It was a brute force instrument, a hammer of pure energy. And, in a desperate, searing flash of inspiration, I saw it not as a tool for ships, but a weapon. My brain was a biological machine operating on electrical impulses. The pattern, whatever it was, had to be a structure of information encoded within that system. What if I could just wipe the slate clean, scramble the data with a powerful enough magnetic field? It was an insane idea. The safety protocols for the chamber were pages long. Exposure to that level of electromagnetism could flash boil the water in your cells, erase your memory, or simply stop your heart. But the alternative, becoming a walking puppet for a cosmic horror, was infinitely worse. That night, I moved with a feverish purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. It was my old self, the problem solver, the shipwright, back in command, but for a horrifying new task. I bypassed the main control panel, manually rerouting the power conduits. I disabled every automated safety alarm, every emergency shutoff. Finally, I stood before the thick, shielded door of the chamber, a length of insulated cable in my hand, jerry-rigged to a remote trigger. I sealed myself inside. The chamber was cavernous and silent, the air still and cold. The walls were lined with massive, interwoven copper coils that pulsed with a faint, latent energy. For a moment, the architect in my head seemed to sense the danger. The gentle, compulsive pressure suddenly became a frantic psychic shriek, a spike of pure agony lancing through my skull, begging, threatening, commanding me to get out. "Go to hell," I gasped, clutching the remote trigger. I jammed the activation button. The world ceased to exist in any recognizable form. A low hum escalated to a ground-shaking roar in less than a second. The air ionized, crackling with an ozone-sharp tang. Every hair on my body stood on end. My teeth began to vibrate, and the metal fillings felt like they were trying to rip themselves out of my jaw. The pulse hit me not as a wave, but as a total immersion in a sea of raw power. It was pure, agonizing noise, not in my ears, but in every cell of my body. The pattern in my vision flared into a sun-blinding supernova of geometric light, a final, defiant scream of agony, and then it shattered into a million fading pieces. The pulse lasted 10 seconds. It felt like 10 lifetimes. When it cut out, the sudden silence was as deafening as the roar that had preceded it. I collapsed onto the cold deck plating, my body spasming uncontrollably. A thin trickle of blood ran from my nose. But as the tremors subsided, I noticed something incredible. Silence. Not just in the chamber, but in my head. The pressure was gone. The constant, insidious whisper was gone. The geometric overlays were gone. I looked at my own hands, and for the first time in weeks, they were just my hands. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over me. I had won. I had taken its weapon, information, and blasted it into nothing with my own tool, raw energy. Lying there on the floor of the degaussing chamber, gasping for breath, I felt a wave of triumphant relief. I was me again, I was free. The silence lasted for 17 hours. It was the most beautiful, perfect peace I have ever known. I slept a dreamless, heavy sleep, untroubled by whispers or alien geometries. I woke and walked the gantries of the dry dock, the clang of metal just a sound again, not a temptation. I breathed deep the oily air of my world and felt in control. The degaussing chamber had been a brutal, desperate gambit, and it had worked. I had scoured the parasite from my mind. I was a fool. The silence wasn't a cure. It was a Trojan horse. It wasn't dead. It had been playing possum, analyzing the attack, learning and adapting. I was in the foundry section, watching the slow, mesmerizing river of molten slag being poured into cooling troughs. The heat was immense, a familiar comfort. I raised a hand to wipe sweat from my brow, and my arm froze mid-air. A jolt like a massive static shock shot through my spine. But it wasn't my body seizing. It was my body being seized. Every muscle in my body locked rigid. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords wouldn't respond. I tried to step back from the intense heat of the crucible, but my legs were rooted to the spot. I was utterly, completely paralyzed, a prisoner inside my own skeleton. The architect roared back to life, no longer a subtle whisper, but a deafening, triumphant declaration of ownership. The degaussing hadn't destroyed it. It had merely forced it to evolve from a backseat driver into a hijacker who had just cut the brake lines. My body, acting on a will that was not mine, turned. My right hand, a traitor of flesh and bone, shot out and gripped my left forearm in a vice of terrifying strength. I was a puppet forced to manhandle itself. My internal screams were a silent, useless cacophony of terror as my own body dragged me towards the crucible. The heat was blistering, peeling the skin from my face. My eyes, the only part of me I could still move, darted wildly, pleading with an empty room. The architect forced my left arm forward, inexorably, holding it over the shimmering, incandescent orange of the molten slag. A piece of a half-finished sculpture, one of the serrated metal arcs I had tried to destroy days earlier, lay on a nearby bench. My right hand released my arm, picked up the alien component, and held it against my left forearm like a grotesque splint. Then, with a smooth, purposeful, and utterly monstrous motion, it plunged my arm, metal and all, into the crucible. The agony was absolute, a universe of pain that incinerated thought. The sound was a wet, violent sizzle as my flesh, fat, and muscle vaporized on contact. The smell was the coppery, sick stench of my own cooked blood. The architect held me there, forcing me to endure the unendurable, until the jagged metal component was glowing cherry red, melded to the very bones of my forearm. Then it pulled me back and, in another fluid, horrifying movement, plunged my burning arm into a quenching tank. The hiss of steam was explosive. The shock of the cold water against my incinerated nerves sent a fresh wave of agony through me, so intense that I thought my heart would stop. When it was over, when my body finally relaxed its tyrannical grip on itself, I staggered back and looked down. My left arm was no longer entirely my own. From wrist to elbow, a twisted, serrated piece of the alien beacon was fused directly to me. Blackened, charred flesh was welded around the raw metal, which seemed to suck the light from the room. It was no longer a component. It was a part of me. The blueprint wasn't just in my head anymore. The architect had started building, using my own body as the foundation. The pain was a living thing, a white-hot serpent coiling around my arm, its fangs sunk deep into the marrow of my bones. But it was distant. My consciousness felt partitioned. I was an observer trapped behind the eyes of a body that was no longer mine to command. Staring at the grotesque fusion of scorched flesh and alien metal that had been my forearm, a cold, terrible clarity settled over the shrieking terror. I couldn't win. Not like this. The battle inside my own skull was over. The architect had weathered my best attack and responded by taking a physical hostage. It wasn't just influencing my thoughts anymore. It had hardwired itself into my nervous system, writing its code directly into my biology. Fighting it was like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Every tool I could use, every secret of the dry dock I knew, it knew too. It was wearing me like a suit. My stolen hand flexed, the fused metal scraping against my side. The compulsion to build surged through me, no longer an urge, but a biological imperative, as fundamental as breathing. The pattern in my mind flared with a new intensity, showing me not just fragments, but the full, breathtaking horror of the finished design. It was a spire of jagged angles and impossible curves, a cathedral of madness designed to scream a single, terrible note into the void. And it wanted more of me. The blueprint demanded organic components, interwoven circuitry of flesh and wire. This arm was just the beginning. As the architect began to steer my feet back toward the workshop, a new thought took root in the tiny, walled-off corner of my mind that was still my own. A final, terrible choice began to form, born not of hope, but of pure, spiteful desperation. If I can't stop it from being built, then I will choose where it dies. I knew this station better than the men who designed it. I knew its strengths, its weaknesses, its heart, and how to stop it. I stopped fighting the pull towards the workshop. Instead, I let my own deep knowledge of the dry dock's layout merge with the architect's alien desires. I gave it a destination, a suggestion. My gaze drifted across the massive open space of the primary fabrication floor, past the half-finished ships and towering gantries, to the far end of the station, to Bay 1. The reclamation and disposal sector, a polite name for the station's furnace, a massive plasma incinerator used to vaporize industrial waste, decommissioned drone hulls, anything that needed to be reduced to its constituent atoms. Its mouth was a 30-meter-wide maw of shielded tungsten, and when it was active, its core burned hotter than the surface of a blue giant. The architect in my head considered the location. It saw a large, open area with access to heavy lifting equipment and high-energy power sources. It saw an ideal construction site. It approved. The pressure in my mind eased, guiding me toward Bay 1. I started walking, a lurching, stumbling gait. The pain in my arm was a cleansing fire, a reminder of what was at stake. I couldn't win the internal battle. My body and mind were compromised beyond salvation. So I would change the terms of the fight. I would stop being a resistor and become a guide, a saboteur. I would finish the beacon. I would give the architect the masterpiece it so desperately craved, and I would build it right in the jaws of hell. The next hours, or were they days, blurred into a terrifying fugue state of creation. I was no longer a man. I was an instrument, a vessel for a purpose that was not my own. The last vestiges of Silas the shipwright, the part of me that was now focused solely on sabotage, retreated into a small, silent corner of my consciousness to watch the architect work. And the work was impossibly, horribly masterful. It began by commandeering a heavy-lift mech, its huge hydraulic arms moving with a grace and precision they were never designed for. Massive girders of scrap metal, some weighing several tons, were lifted and slotted into place as if they were children's toys. The foundation of the beacon took shape in the cavernous space before the incinerator's maw, a chaotic lattice of steel that somehow achieved a perfect alien symmetry. My hands, one of flesh, one a fused grotesque of metal and bone, drove rivets, sealed joints, and laid welds that were things of terrible beauty. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. The architect knew what it wanted. The purely mental compulsion had been a torment, but this was a deeper violation. To see my own expertise, the sum of my life's work, being used to construct this monstrosity, it was like being forced to write a confession in my own blood. Then came the next phase. The blueprint demanded more than inert metal. It required a bio-organic interface, a nervous system to regulate its unholy energies. The architect turned its attention to the only raw organic material, me. Guided by the entity, I found spools of high-conductivity fiber-optic wiring. With a plasma cutter held in a terrifyingly steady hand, I began to operate on myself. Searing lines of pain traced paths across my torso as the architect carved channels into my own skin and muscle. Then it began weaving the wires through the raw flesh, threading them around my ribs, connecting them to the fused metal on my left arm. Each new connection sent a jolt of alien data through my nervous system. Star charts of unknown galaxies, whispers of physics that defied all logic. I screamed, but no sound came out. The architect had muted my vocal cords. I could only watch, a helpless passenger, as it transformed my body into a living circuit board. It needed more structural integrity, more anchor points. It took heavy plasteel plates, heated them to a dull red with a torch, and fused them directly to my chest and spine. The smell of my own burning flesh filled the air. My body was no longer a cage. It was becoming part of the machine. Throughout the ordeal, the small, hidden part of me clung to its purpose. While the architect was absorbed in its grand design, Silas, the saboteur, was subtly influencing the placement. A crucial power conduit lay a few centimeters closer to the incinerator's induction field. A primary support girder placed just within the lip of the blast door. Small, insignificant choices that the arrogant intelligence in my skull didn't even notice. It was so consumed with the act of creation, it never questioned the convenience of the location I had guided it to. It was building its god, and I was digging its grave. The currency, the war, The power would be lost if only one thing. The final piece was a crystalline focusing lens, scavenged from the guts of a decommissioned transport ship. The architect forced my mutilated body to climb the 30-meter structure, my bare feet finding purchase on the jagged metalwork, the wires woven through my flesh pulling taut with every movement. I reached the apex, a dizzying height overlooking the vast, dark mouth of the incinerator. With my one good hand and the metal and bone tool that was my other arm, I slotted the crystal into place. There was a final, sickening click. It was done. For a moment, all was still. Then a low hum began to emanate from the beacon. A subsonic thrum that vibrated not in the air, but in my bones, in the fillings in my teeth, in the very fabric of space around us. The structure, an effigy of twisted steel and my own desecrated flesh, began to glow with a faint, internal violet light. The wires running through me grew warm, then hot, searing me from the inside. The psychic pressure in my skull, the driving, relentless command to build, shifted. The command was fulfilled. It transformed into a single, deafening, triumphant psychic scream. It wasn't a sound, it was an emotion, a wave of pure, predatory ecstasy broadcasted directly into my consciousness. The beacon was active. It was singing its silent, terrible song to the cold, listening dark between the stars. The architect had what it wanted. For a crucial, singular moment, its attention was on its creation, not its tool. In that instant, control flooded back into my limbs. I was free. With a gasping sob, I tore myself away from the structure. Wires ripped from my flesh, taking muscle and skin with them. I fell more than climbed, sliding down the metallic skeleton, heedless of the sharp edges that tore at me. I landed in a crumpled heap at the base, my body a ruin of burns, cuts, and exposed circuitry. Blood loss made the world swim. The triumphant scream in my head was a physical force trying to push me into unconsciousness. But my purpose was a burning ember in the wreckage of my mind. I staggered towards the incinerator control pulpit, a small, shielded room 10 meters from the bay doors. Every step was an agony. Behind me, the beacon's hum rose in pitch, its light pulsing faster, a monstrous heart preparing to call its masters home. I stumbled through the door of the control room and collapsed against the main console. My hand, shaking violently, hovered over the emergency purge activation panel. It was a large, palm-sized button protected by a hinged safety cover. It's beautiful, in its own terrible way, a part of me thought, gazing at the pulsating, geometric horror I had been forced to create. And now it burns. The alien scream in my skull became a shriek of sudden panicked rage as it realized my intent. But it was too late. I slammed my palm down on the button. Alarms blared. For a half-second, nothing happened. Then, the colossal tungsten blast doors of the incinerator slid open with a deafening groan. A wave of heat washed over the control room's viewport, intense enough to crack the reinforced glass. And then came the fire. Not fire, plasma. A torrent of pure, condensed star stuff. A river of white-hot annihilation erupted from the furnace's maw, utterly silent in the vacuum of the bay. It struck the beacon, and the universe turned white. The monstrous effigy didn't melt or explode, it simply ceased to be, vaporized in less than a heartbeat. The psychic shriek in my mind, the voice of the architect, was cut off mid-scream, not fading, but annihilated. And then, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was only silence. A profound, blessed, and utterly terrifying silence. The roar of the plasma was a distant, physical thing. The screaming in my head was finally, truly gone. I lay collapsed on the grated floor of the control pulpit, my cheek pressed against the cold metal. The roar of the incinerator was a dull, constant presence beyond the cracked viewport, its searing white light painting strobing, nightmarish shadows across the room. My ragged breaths were the only other sound, each one a painful, scraping effort. The alien presence, the architect, wasn't just quiet. It was gone, obliterated. I had expected relief, a flood of triumphant peace. Instead, what rushed in to fill the void was a hollow, cavernous emptiness. The space it had occupied in my mind for so long was now a raw, amputated wound. It felt like a part of my own consciousness had been carved out, leaving behind a crater of perfect, painful silence. For weeks, I had been two minds in one body. Now, I was barely one. Slowly, shakily, I pushed myself into a sitting position. My body was a disaster. Blood loss had left me dizzy and weak. My chest and back were a mangled mess of torn flesh where the wires had been ripped out. My left arm simply ended. The incinerator's blast had been so precise, so absolute. It had vaporized the alien metal and the arm it was fused to, instantly cauterizing the stump just below my shoulder in a blackened, smoking ruin. There was no pain from it, just a profound and unsettling numbness. The familiar sounds of the dry dock began to filter back into my awareness as the incinerator cycle wound down. The distant clang of a hammer, the hiss of a hydraulic press, the low hum of the station's life support. These sounds, once the comforting bedrock of my existence, now felt alien and distant, like noises heard from underwater. They were the sounds of a world I no longer belonged to. They were the sounds of men who were whole, men whose hands and minds were still their own. A rescue team, alerted by the manual override of the incinerator, eventually broke through the door. Their voices were muffled, their faces indistinct behind their emergency helmets. They moved with a practiced urgency, but I couldn't connect with it. I felt removed, a ghost observing a scene. They spoke to me, but their words didn't register. They were speaking to Silas the shipwright, and I wasn't sure he existed anymore. They loaded me onto a stretcher, and as they carried me through the bay, past the scorch marks where my terrible creation had stood, I felt a tremor of something new. It wasn't relief or fear. It was a kind of existential vertigo. The architect was gone, but its creation had been the most magnificent, terrible thing I had ever built. The sheer power of its design, the awful perfection of its geometry, had left an echo. My hands, my expertise had given form to a nightmare. In the sudden, brutal quiet of my mind, the horror wasn't what the alien had done to me, but the horrifying realization of what we had together. The silence wasn't peace. It was the echo of a scream. The thriller. The voice should be crisp and direct. The voice should be tense and suspenseful, with a slightly conspiratorial, low-pitch delivery. The pace should be steady, but able to quicken during moments of action. Weeks later, the medbay finally released me. They had done what they could. My back and chest were a latticework of scar tissue and synth-skin grafts. My left arm was fitted with a crude industrial prosthetic, a functional claw of unpainted steel and whining servos bolted to the cauterized stump of my shoulder. It was strong, but clumsy. I could lift a crate, but I couldn't hold a welding torch steady. My fine motor skills, the source of my pride and my livelihood, were gone forever. I walk the gantries of Dry Dock Gamma 7 again, but not as a creator. They gave me a new job, safety inspector, a pity post. I carry a data pad and a checklist, observing other men do the work that was once my entire life. I am a ghost in my own past, haunting the places where I once felt most alive. The familiar sounds are a torment now. The bright, sudden flare of a plasma cutter makes me flinch, my heart seizing in my chest. The deep hum of a ship's reactor warming up sounds like a whisper, and I have to fight the urge to run. My coworkers give me a wide berth. They know the official story, a horrific industrial accident involving an experimental power source. But they see the look in my eyes, the constant haunted tremor in my remaining hand. They see a man who went into the guts of an alien ship and came out broken, something vital left behind in the dark. The nights are the worst. The silence in my head is a constant companion. It's a hollow space where something used to be, and its absence is a weight, a pressure. The doctors gave me pills for PTSD, but they can't touch the real injury. They can't medicate a scar on the soul. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, standing on a gantry high above a half-finished hull, I feel an itch. It isn't the familiar tingling of a phantom limb, the ghost of a missing hand. It's deeper. An itch in the back of my skull, a faint, familiar restlessness. It feels like a thought that isn't mine, trying to form. It's a ghost of a whisper, a memory of a desire. I look at the raw steel, at the complex machinery, and I feel a twinge. Not an order, not a compulsion, but a fleeting, horrifying echo of understanding, a glimpse of an impossible angle, a memory of a perfect, terrible curve. I close my eyes and clutch the cold metal railing with my clumsy prosthetic, waiting for it to pass. The architect is dead. I saw it burn. But a design, a truly perfect design, never really disappears. And I know, with a certainty that freezes the marrow in my bones, that somewhere in the hollow silence of my mind, a ghost is still dreaming of things to build.